Welcome back to Ohio Counseling Conversations, the official podcast of the Ohio Counseling Association, bringing you updates and conversations from around the state. In this episode, we have a truly inspiring guest, Kailey Bradley, who brings a wealth of knowledge and experience in childhood grief and bereavement. Kailey's dedication to companioning and advocating for grievers shines through in all she does. Throughout the episode, Kailey will share her insights on childhood grief and the power of presence in the healing process. Whether you're a counseling professional, a grieving family member, or someone looking to understand more about this essential field, this episode is filled with valuable perspectives and advice. And as always, I am your host today, Dr. Marissa Cargill, a counselor in Northeast Ohio and counselor educator at the University of Akron. Thanks for joining us today. Let's dig in. Welcome back to Ohio Counseling Conversations. This is your host. I'm Marissa Cargill, and I am here with one of our former guests, one of the podcast committee members who has also hosted, Kailey Bradley. And I want to give a soft plug. If you have not listened to the very first episode of Ohio Counseling Conversations, Permission to Grieve, it's a great one. Our guest, Kailey, really has a passion for supporting people who are grieving. And today we're going to spend a little time talking about a specific population and supporting them. But before we even dig into that, Kailey, welcome. It's nice to see your
Hi.
face. And, um, for those who maybe haven't heard that episode, you mind sharing a little bit about yourself so that they can get a nice intro?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So when I was a newly licensed counselor back in 2015, um, long story short, I had done some volunteer work at a local hospice agency, particularly a childhood bereavement camp, and truly kind of fell in love with supporting, which this is what we're going to talk about today, child and adolescent grievers. I think sometimes that demographic can be forgotten. We think kids and teens are resilient, which is very true. But what I would like to convey today is they need that supportive and kind of holding environment, kind of for that resiliency to flourish. And so, spent about 5 years as a hospice bereavement coordinator where I did a wide range of things like our children's grief camp, childhood grief support groups in our local schools. Um, and I am just thrilled to share a little bit about my passion today, Marissa. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So we're going to spend some time talking specifically about working with childhood bereavement and grief issues. You alluded to it, but like what really drew you to this work? Why is it so important to you and in general?
Yeah. So I often say in my various capacities, I also am an adjunct professor at both Ashland Theological Seminary and also at Marian College in their online thanatology program. And I often say that supporting kids and teens in grief, I think, is preventative mental health care. I did some internship work at a locked residential treatment center for teenagers. Their behaviors were really just unprocessed grief in many ways. And I often felt that if there had been the opportunity, right, for them to express or to even be able to identify grief, that I think some of these behaviors would have been um, not the issue that they were by the time they got to a situation where they were in a locked facility.
So it like manifested to a point where they needed that support. Had they gotten it sooner,
Yeah,
maybe it wouldn't have been the
yeah.
same exact
And I think
outcome.
it's so important now collectively. Um, COVID-19, so many children and adolescents lost caregivers
Mm,
and lost adults in their lives, lost routine, right? Structure,
gosh.
lost a sense of like, yeah,
Yeah.
safety, all of the things, right? And
Mhm,
so I think we're really permeated with grief right now.
mhm.
And that's true for adults, but again, it's true for kids. Children grieve, they just grieve differently.
Yeah, can you speak more to that and like the pandemic? Because we know it had such a large impact on, people all across the board, all across the world. And what, like, I guess, do we feel like, or do you feel like, is really important in terms of grief support and advocacy for children and teens as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think kids may not sit down and say to you, like, Miss Kailey, I'm really grieving X, Y, or Z. But as I've already alluded to, it may come out in behaviors, may
Hmm.
come out in somatic sensations, right? Kids will often say, "Oh, Miss Kailey, my belly hurts." And when we really sit and process, it's often grief related, especially with my client base. So I think we forget that, yeah, it's going to look a little bit different, but just as we were so disoriented during that experience of COVID as adults, I think it's even more disorienting for children who maybe didn't have the language or the tool set to really be able to process and be able to access some of the coping skills that we maybe would have had as adults.
Right. And if their adults were struggling to figure it
Yeah,
all out, then, kind of that trickle down is difficult because
absolutely.
we were all in a state of like, huh?
Yeah, we were all
Yeah.
doing the best we could. Yeah,
Yep.
for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, you mentioned your work as an adjunct professor and as
Yeah.
a fellow counselor educator, yay.
Mhm.
But I think it's important, especially for listeners of this podcast, whether they are counseling students, newer professionals, or even seasoned professionals who maybe just don't have a lot of exposure to this topic. What are some key principles that you emphasize in your courses to support grief counseling or childhood bereavement?
Yeah. So there's often an anxiety and a fear around grief, and that gets amplified with kids. I think we feel like we have to have an answer to every question that a kiddo
Mm,
may ask us. I really try to hit hard with my students that there may not be an answer, nor is the child really looking for that. What they really want to know is that you're a safe person that they can ask those tough questions to. And you're not going to minimize, you're not going to judge those questions. That you're kind of that, to use a humanistic counseling language, right? That unconditional positive regard, right? You're kind of that safe base. And when I work with caregivers and parents, I often remind them of that too. You are your child's safe base, right? And so um, you don't have to have the magic formula or magic answer. It's okay to not know. I also tell my students that it's also okay, like, if emotion comes up for you, that's not
mm,
something that you need to, automatically label as negative. Um, Creativity is also super important. I'm kind of jumping
yeah,
all over the place as I think about some
yeah.
of these core tenets, but I do think working with childhood bereavement it does require a little bit of creativity and flexibility. As I already mentioned, they may not say, I'm feeling X, Y, or Z. But man, if we put some music on, or if we draw, or if we
Yeah.
engage, expressive arts modalities, that grief comes out, right? And that can be very, very healing and cathartic. So being willing to, yeah, be creative and flexible and kind of resisting the idea that a typical counseling session has to look a particular way. I
Mhm.
think I've often really I hate this word, but failed as a counselor when I insist that a session has to look a particular way. And I think my grieving kids have really taught me that I have to be so mindful of the child in front of me and really
Sure.
relinquish my own expectations about what this is going to look like, or
Mhm.
what goals we need to meet, right? I have to make sure that I
Yeah.
don't lose sight of the kid in front of me.
Yeah. Yeah. And even if there are goals to be met, that this is a living human, just as much as our adult clients, but with someone who maybe, like you said, doesn't have all the skill set to verbalize everything they might be feeling. And so beyond just maybe getting comfortable, not having answers is something you alluded to, I think, very early in this conversation of like being a holding space
Yeah,
in those moments. Yeah.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
do you think that there are some things that you'd like to share with us, like what's important that anyone knows about working with this population, listeners who are professionals or otherwise?
Yeah. I think it's important when you think about childhood bereavement to think of it from a developmental perspective as well. That kids and teenagers kind of develop an understanding of their loss across their lifespan. So, for example, I was recently working with a high school senior who lost her dad when she was, I think, around 7 or 8, and she said to me, "Why does it feel like I'm like re-grieving?"
Mm.
Um, but when we really process, of course you are, right? Like you have all of these
Heck yeah.
transitions,
Mhm.
all of these milestones, and your dad's not there, right? So I think it's important to keep that in mind, that grief is not something that has this definitive end point, and that's true for all of us, but really is important when you work with kids. That again, developmental perspectives are so important, and also that a young child may not have what we call a mature understanding of death and dying. And really what I mean by that is they don't fully understand what that is, right?
Yeah.
And so they're going to learn different nuances and pieces of that as they age, and that's very
Yeah.
normal and developmentally appropriate.
Yeah.
I would say another thing that I would really want to relay to listeners. I get this question a lot. Should I bring my kid to the funeral? I get that question
Oh,
probably
yeah.
like a weekly basis. And my answer is typically unequivocally yes. I think it's so vitally important to allow children to be a part of rituals, to be a part of conversations surrounding the loss of a loved one, whether that's maybe they can help pick out a song for the funeral. Maybe they can do a reading during the funeral if they're comfortable. Maybe they're not comfortable being up front, but maybe there's a bunch of pictures that they can color and display at the funeral home.
Mhm.
I think it's really important to involve children. Um, One of my heroes is Fred Rogers, and he always said that children can handle something when they're given information. And I'm botching that quote,
Yeah.
the nuances of it, but basically what he's saying is kids can handle what we prepare them for, right? And so if we give them information and we couple that with being a safe holding environment, I don't think we have to be afraid of allowing our kids to be a part of this.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I'm writing that down. Kids
And again, I know I'll
can
have to look.
handle what we prefer or prepare
Yeah,
them for. Yeah, kids can handle
yeah,
what we prepare them for. And I think
yeah.
that's speaks to everything you've been saying. Like we can say we don't have an answer, but being able to like share emotion and let them share emotion and sort of normalize that. And I
Mhm,
appreciate you speaking to like also the life transitions in terms of a developmental approach, not
mhm,
just like, hey, are we speaking to children in ways that are developmentally appropriate? Yes, of course, that's important, but also understanding that like there's not a timeline. I find I don't work with kiddos, but when I'm working with my adults, I think even like there's that mentality in our culture a lot about like I should be over it.
yeah,
And
yeah.
obviously I think we can understand there's some misconceptions there because grief is lasting, but it does change and it evolves, and sometimes with life transitions gets a little bigger or comes more to the surface than it had
Mhm.
been, at other times, and all sorts of things can cause that for someone. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And normalizing that is, I think, a really big piece of the work that I do. I like to say that grief work is permission giving, and I think giving kids a big permission slip that they can grieve in the ways that feel appropriate to them. I would also add to just things that I would want listeners to know. I think autonomy is so important for
Mm,
kids too. Giving them the opportunity to share what they think about a situation. Um, a lot of times big existential meaning making questions come up after a
oh,
loss.
yeah.
And, kids will ask me, Miss Kailey, where is my grandma, or where is grandpa? And, it's really hard to not maybe feel like you have to come up with, again, a magic answer. But one of the most effective things that I have found is really allowing them to share what they think, right? Kids don't get enough opportunity, I think, to share, yeah, what do they think about these things? And really giving that autonomy and empowerment, I think, is really, really key here as well. And again, letting them explore, letting them ask questions with no judgment. Yeah, super, super important.
Yeah. Are there specific strategies or techniques that you feel like would be really effective or you've found particularly effective in working with grieving children?
Yeah, so I already mentioned I really do use a lot of creativity and expressive arts. We do a lot of collage making. I use a lot of children's literature. Um, where we can kind of talk about loss, but from kind of a distance, right? Sometimes it's
Yeah,
easier to connect with a character in a book or, a story than it is to kind of be able to really say, oh, that's how I'm feeling.
right.
Um, I use a lot of popular culture as well. One of the uh, highlights of my time as a hospice bereavement coordinator, we did a Harry Potter grief camp because what I
Oh,
found was so many of the characters, if you're familiar with those books, experience loss, right? Harry loses both of his parents. Um, and one of the things that was super interesting is our kids really resonated in particular with the ways in which Harry struggled to feel um, like he connected to his friends after that
mm,
loss. He kind
yeah,
of describes feeling like no one really understands. Uh, my friends are talking about, oh, I hate my mom. And here I am sitting like, my mom just died, right? So they really connected to that. And I don't know if they would have been as open about it if they didn't have that, just that one little layer of
yeah,
removal or distance. So
yeah.
yeah, creativity, popular culture. Again, I think being ready and prepared that yeah, it may look a little bit different than your quote unquote traditional, psychotherapy session. Again, they're likely not going to say I feel X, Y, or Z, right? So again, that flexibility. My mentor, Dr. Alan Wolfelt, developed this beautiful theory called companioning the
Uh-huh.
bereaved. And he really talks about things like compassionate curiosity. Tell
Mhm.
me more. What's this like for you? Really want to invest in your experience. I say to all my clients, I'm not the expert. You are,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
You're the expert
Mhm.
on your grief. So
Yeah.
please teach me, right? I'm a learner along this process with you. And I truly believe that. I think that so much mutual learning happens in a session and also as a counselor educator too. I learned so much when I kind of have a humble perspective and
Yeah.
really adapt that posture of I don't have to have all the answers. I don't have all the answers. And I can really be present again to what's going on right in front of me.
I love that. Um, Shifting a little bit, similar topic, but I guess for the adults, the key figures that are supporting, children or teens in their lives that are grieving, any specific suggestions? What can they do to help these kids and teens?
Yeah. So I do some work with schools, and I have the utmost respect for teachers. My whole family are public school educators, so I often get a lot of questions like from teachers, right? Like, how do I support a grieving student? And it's silly, but even things like, do they really need 25 math problems for homework? Or based on what we know is going on with this kiddo, can we maybe adjust that a little bit, right?
Mhm.
Um, and it's not that you are, getting rid of discipline or expectations or boundaries, but you're really saying, okay, based on what this kiddo is going through, can we be mindful of that, right? And can we do some tweaking of adjustments and expectations? For adults, I think maybe a little bit on the flip side, but not really. I do think consistency and routine are so crucial. So many grieving kids, when they experience a significant loss, feel very unmoored and very much like, who's going to take care of me, right? And so
Yeah.
that consistency is so key. Um, I have such a soft spot for parents who are navigating maybe their own grief while trying to companion their child and their grief. It's like a double
Yeah.
grief. So I also encourage folks, it's okay to get your own help as an adult,
Uh-huh.
right? It's okay to have
Yeah.
your own spaces where you feel like you can process.
Mhm.
There's
Mhm.
certainly no shame. And, if emotions come up with your kid, I get that question a lot too. Is it okay if my kid sees me cry? I think there's very much a difference between, yes, that and putting all the emotion on your child. And so that's where,
Correct. Yeah.
yeah, that's where I say finding that balance, right? If you need a space where you can emotionally dump, right? That's so critical, whether that's a
Mhm.
friend or a counselor or support group. That's really, really key. But it's also on the flip side, it is okay for an adult to say to a child, I miss mom too, or hey, I'm struggling today, buddy. How are you handling this and this, right now? This is a hard day for me. Do you ever have hard days, right? So it's certainly okay to show that emotion, but it's also okay to find other outlets.
Yeah.
And we need that.
Normalize that it's okay to talk about it
Yeah.
in, like, appropriate ways with your kids, but, like, the to talk about it is normal, like,
Yes.
and like you said, permission giving, like, when parents model that for their kiddos, yeah.
Yeah, and
Okay.
sharing memories, I think, is super key too, in whatever way that looks comfortable to your family, right? Some people
Mhm,
really love sharing pictures and taking time and sharing memories, and I think it's really important to keep that continuing bond with that person
mhm,
alive.
mhm.
It's really important.
Yeah, yeah. I know I talk a lot about ritual with some of my grieving clients. I would argue we grieve a lot, right? Like not always just people too, right? Other experiences and losses. I'm curious what kinds of maybe non-death related things you feel
Mm,
like kids and teens might be grieving
mhm.
that we also should become more aware of so we can support them.
My grief counseling students probably get tired of me saying that I think it is a disservice that we don't have a ton of training in grief in our
Mm.
programs, right?
Yes.
Um, because I think all of our clients are navigating grief of some sort. But for teenagers and kids, things like pet loss, it's a big one
Mm,
that comes up. Moving, right?
mhm.
Friend transitions, breakups. A
Yep.
pet peeve of mine is when we tell teenagers, "Oh, there's plenty of fish in the sea. You're going to be fine." Which, as an adult, we could, in retrospect, say, "Yeah, absolutely, right? The likelihood you're
Yeah.
gonna, But that feels really minimizing in the moment, right? To a
Yeah,
teenager
that
who's like,
first
"No,
big heartbreak is
yes,
huge,
it's
in the
huge."
context of their developmental experiences, yeah.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Even things like I didn't make a sports team or I didn't make the school play. I mean, those are griefs and we have to create space for that. And I think we often in our culture only associate grief with death loss. But
Yeah,
again, my bias is I think, yeah, all of our clients are navigating loss of some sort.
yeah, yeah. Switch gears real hard left here, but
Yeah.
still staying on topic. I guess in terms of the broader grief topic, you've been recognized as an emerging leader with the Association of Child and Adolescent Counseling, right?
Yes, yes.
I know grief is such a passion topic for you. Can you tell us more about like your advocacy work and what it means to you with this organization at state national level? Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think it's been so important for me in my career to find like-minded individuals doing work with children and adolescents. And so, yeah, organizations like the Association for Child and Adolescent Counseling have been so formational to me. Also, one of my favorite organizations, the National Alliance for Children's Grief (NACG), um, just a robust resource. I recommend all counselors kind of explore. They have wonderful workbooks that are free and easily accessible that you can print off. I was a part of two of those work groups. One was on creating kid friendly spaces at funeral homes, the other was on supporting children who have lost somebody to overdose. So there's just a plethora of resources on their particular um, website, which is just nacg.org.
Mhm.
So I
We'll be
think it
sure
has
to link that too.
yeah, no, for sure. I think it's been really important for me to not feel isolated in the work that I do, to feel like I have those connections, and also to feel like I'm part of a larger mission, which is to create advocacy around children's bereavement. That really gives me a sense of meaning and purpose. On those days where I'm like, this is kind of heavy and overwhelming, to remind myself that I am a part of a larger community, who really believes that this is important work. And certainly in decades past, there really wasn't, right? There just wasn't this emphasis on childhood mental health, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
We're making progress. I think we still got a
Yeah.
long ways to go. But yeah, advocacy, I think for me has always been a way to find meaning and purpose.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to give you your flowers for a moment. Um, for those of you who are listening who are active on social media, specifically Facebook, Kailey shares so much great content in some of our divisions pages
Yeah.
about
Thank
these
you.
types of resources as they come up, and shares them to the division pages so that we as counselors can become more aware of things that might be really great resources for our teens or for our kiddos or even for our adults from different populations. So, I think that advocacy work extends to a lot of the things you do as an individual, and I am grateful for those because I'm always seeking it. And I know, on a personal level, I come to you a lot because I'm like, Kailey is like an avid reader, so I know she's going to know
I
a
do
book
love
that
books.
might be helpful, like for a client with this experience. And so certainly she gives a lot of those recommendations on these division pages. So if you aren't super active, but you want to like maybe take a look, if you are active and you're not following those pages, follow them. You're going to see great content that Kailey shares out so frequently. So thank you for doing that as a service to all of us. It's important and it's meaningful, especially as someone who maybe doesn't read as much. Like I gotta have time for my Bravo too, right? I'm just kidding. But
Which is
I
important, right? That's important
Yes,
too. We need
it's
those
my
moments of self.
downtime. Yep. But I really do find value in it, and I think anyone who is following along would. And so I just want to give you your flowers on that, but also encourage folks to follow those pages so that we can, use those resources that you share and research. So we can link those division pages and
Be
some of
great. Yes,
the
please. And
OCA general pages in
yeah,
the show
absolutely.
notes
And
of the
I'll
site.
plug. I'm this year's president of the Association for Child and Adolescent Counseling Ohio division, and so we are trying to increase, social media presence for that division, and really trying to build membership. So if you are, yeah, a counselor working with children and adolescents, and maybe feel a little bit isolated. Maybe you didn't even know that there was an OCA division dedicated to that. We're here, and we'd love for folks to get involved. We are hoping to do a couple of webinars this year, as well as some virtual meet and greets. We'll also be at All Ohio. Where I'll put a selfish plug here too. I'm doing a pre-conference session on grief competencies, particularly for school counselors.
Oh, great.
So
Yeah.
I will be there and would love to see folks.
Awesome. Awesome. So we've already mentioned quite a few resources,
Yeah.
but are there other types of resources? What types of resources would you suggest for supporting kids and teens who maybe are experiencing some kind of loss?
Yeah. Like I mentioned, I've already really plugged NACG. Um, there's some wonderful children's bereavement centers in Ohio. Cornerstone of Hope in Cleveland and Columbus is a great resource. They do a lot of groups for families, for kids. So, even wherever you're listening, maybe if this is an area that you want to get involved in or volunteer, volunteering at a children's bereavement center is always a phenomenal way to kind of get your foot wet and to do that.
Mhm.
Um, the Hospice Foundation of America has some wonderful resources for children, particularly for families who have a loved one entering into hospice.
Mhm.
Um, ADEC, the Association for Death Educators and Counselors, um, is probably my professional home. They do certifications in thanatology. They're the only professional organization to do so. So again, if you're seeking educational opportunities, ADEC is a wonderful resource for that. And then there's just a whole host of wonderful children's books.
Mhm.
Um, my favorite, I could give you a whole list, Marissa. We could talk an hour on that, but I'll just plug one. It's called The Rabbit Listened by Corey Dorfield. And it's about this little guy. He's experiencing not particularly a death loss, but little main character is super thrilled. He builds this tower with blocks, but then it gets knocked down. So he's super disappointed. And you have all of these characters. And why I love the book is they're all different woodland creatures. So you've got a bear and you've got a fox, and they are all giving him advice. They're saying, well, you should do this, or have you done that, or aren't you feeling X, Y, or Z? And our main character, he gets a little frustrated. He's like, I don't feel any of those things. But then at the very end, this little rabbit just walks up next to him and he curls up and he listens, right?
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't give any advice. He's just there. And it's
Mm-hmm.
just one of my favorite representations of kind of my philosophy as a grief counselor. I love using it with kids because it opens up conversations about, who are the rabbits in your life? Who are those people that have snuggled up against you and not hit you over the head with advice or shoulds? So that's probably my number one children's book recommendation, but I'm happy to send some others, Marissa, some other
Yeah,
titles.
yeah. We can certainly
Um,
link those too.
there's some
Um,
wonderful ones out there.
yeah. From a strengths based perspective, hate this next question, but I also think it's important to just recognize the reality of the nature of like our field, that there are challenges sometimes with specific experiences or populations. What are some of those challenges or common themes that like a professional might experience in working with someone like a child or teen in this specific area of grief and
Yeah,
loss?
I would say that probably the biggest challenge, in my opinion, is kind of lack of education. And so I already mentioned, a lot of fear and anxiety, maybe thinking there's no, like, I didn't even know that there was a field out there, right, of childhood bereavement that you could specialize in. So I think there's a lack of education and awareness. Transparently, in the past, licensed professional counselors haven't really been able to work in spaces such as hospice organizations because of challenges surrounding things like Medicare,
Mhm.
reimbursement, et cetera. That's
Yeah.
obviously changed, which is
Yes.
super exciting.
Woo-woo.
And yes, absolutely. And so again, I think if this is an interest, even as a counseling student, and I tell my students this all the time, explore it, right? Go to a local hospice agency and talk to the bereavement coordinator or social worker about what it's like to be in this field. Certainly, awareness of burnout, I have
Mm,
to mention.
yeah,
Again, I think when you're working with grieving kids, there is sometimes a sense of like, gosh, why do bad things happen? Right? I want
yeah,
to
yeah.
spare children from this. And so having really, really good supervision has been so important for me, and really trying to find supervision where, yeah, the grief is talked about, right? And it's okay to bring that up. When we work with grieving clients, it's inevitably going to bring up our own grief. Um, that's not something we have to be ashamed about.
Right.
We bring our humanity into the counseling room. It's a part of it, right? But finding safe spaces where you can feel like you can process. So again, whether that's supervision or whether that's finding other professionals doing similar work. Again, that's
Mhm.
why I love organizations like NACG and Association for Child and Adolescent Counseling, because you really do feel like you can, find like-minded individuals and talk about the burnout and how do you handle it, and what do you do when you're feeling crunchy and like you need a break, and really normalize
Mhm.
of that.
Yeah, yeah, and because I think it is important to ask that question, I also think it's important to ask the other side of it. What are some of maybe the wins or benefits that you experience in working with this specialty?
It is one of the richest, I think, experiences. I It's cliche, but I feel so grateful. Like being able to provide a safe space for a child who's grieving. Um, it's so rewarding, right?
Yeah.
And for a child to tell me later, like, Miss Kailey, you listened to me, or you let me talk about my mom, or you let me, um, yeah, my maybe I didn't have an adult in my life to process that with, and you really had that safe space. So it's rewarding. It's meaningful. It's also like it's fun. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
like I laugh. Like kids are funny. Like they,
Oh my
and the way they
gosh.
yeah, the way they see things. There's not necessarily a filter, and sometimes I think we lose that sense of playfulness as adults. And I always say that working with children and teens helps me not take myself so seriously, which I have a
Yes.
tendency. I feel like I have these two parts of me, like the academic talk student part, and then this very playful, child counselor part. And I am very grateful for that part because it really,
Yeah.
yeah, it infuses that playfulness.
Yeah. Sounds like it's grounding in some ways.
Very much so. Very
Yeah.
much so.
Yeah. I'm happy to hear that. Like it's I know the whole like cliche of like feeling grateful and things like that being rewarding um can come off like that. Like maybe it would be cliche, but I hear it in your voice. I see it because I'm watching you on video, although many of you won't be. Um that there's this sense of um fulfillment and um, connection to the work that you do is very evident. So um, I love to hear it and like love to see people doing what means so much to
Mhm.
them personally and professionally. Um, so, kind of winding things down, are there any like final messages or pieces of advice that you feel like you'd like to share with the listeners who might be supporting grieving children and their families?
Yeah, I would say, for counseling students, don't be afraid to pursue this as a specialty. You
Hmm.
know, yeah, there's it's hard work, but like we've already said, good work. I think just reiterating in general, you don't have to have all the answers. That's not what's important in helping a grieving child. Just be present. Just show up. That's all. Really, it really is. And just show up with your authentic self, because that really does translate. Really does.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And so I already know that you know what's coming next because you are also,
Question, yes.
also someone who hosts this podcast on occasion as well as serves on the committee. So you were there when we developed this question, but we ask it on every episode. So the name of the podcast is Ohio Counseling Conversations. What important conversations do you think counseling professionals should be having with each other and or their clients in the state?
Yeah, it's a little bit off topic, but not because it's related to our conversation on burnout. But I think we
Mhm.
need to be talking to one another about how can we companion one another as
Mm,
professionals. How can
yeah,
we take care of one another? How can we make sure that we're okay as professionals, right? And what do we need to do to help one another and kind of sustain ourselves? So yeah, how can we take care of one another in the profession? I think is a conversation um, we need to be having. I think logistically, always conversations about challenges with insurance reimbursement and the
sure.
complexities of is grief a mental health diagnosis or not. I mean, that's a whole other podcast, but certainly there are logistical questions. But I would say really, really at the forefront for me is, yeah, how can we take care of one another?
Yeah, yeah. And I'm like having a moment in trouble recalling who else has said that, but I feel like that has been a theme in asking this question with
Yeah,
some of our other guests of
I think
like,
it has too.
yeah, how can we better support one another? How can we have this professional network that does feel more connected? And I think OCA is doing a lot to offer those opportunities up. And I would share to the listeners, I guess, that if you feel like you're disconnected in some ways, lean into asking a question, email us at the podcast, and we can try and help get you connected to other leaders. We try to interview some other leaders or experts in the field specifically in our area. And so we always want people to feel supported. And we know that sometimes there's trouble reaching out, but this is us reaching out to you
Hmm.
with those messages of
Yeah.
encouragement. But yeah, I think it's a great point, Kailey, that like this is a theme that continues to come up. And I wonder if some of that is the result of the pandemic, like we were talking about before, of like that disconnect, and finding ways to reconnect is really important. But
Yeah, we can't do this work in isolation. That's for sure.
mm-mm, not at all. So thank you so much for sharing with us rather this more specific content about how we companion kids and teens, and encouraging us to companion one another as
Mhm.
well. This has been such a great conversation, and we so appreciate you not only for the conversation today, but the work that you do for our divisions and on a national level. Thank you for serving the profession.
Of course. Thank you so
Yeah,
much for having me.
awesome. Well, this has been another episode of Ohio Counseling Conversations. We look forward to talking to you again soon, and we'll see you then.
Ohio Counseling Conversations is on a mission to make this podcast meaningful to you, and we can't do that without your help. A feedback form is linked in the show notes for this episode and is also available on the OCA Linktree. If you have any recommendations for topics or guests or any other general feedback, you can let us know by using the form. We welcome your thoughts so that we can continue to develop the podcast and grow as creators. If you are interested in joining the team or being a guest, you can also reach us by emailing ohiocounselingconversations@gmail.com. We value your insight. Thank you so much for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to follow us so you can stay up to date with Ohio Counseling Conversations online and wherever you listen to podcasts.
This podcast is brought to you by the Ohio Counseling Association's Media, Public Relations, and Membership Committee and its podcast subcommittee. This podcast features original music selections by Elijah Sotoder-Wood and our closing song, Accretion Discotheque by Who A.D. Views, beliefs, or references mentioned in this episode do not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by the Ohio Counseling Association. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the podcast does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Views and opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect the view of the Ohio Counseling Association or any of its officials. Thank you.